Welcome to the 11th in our webinar series and the last of 2024. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, European Capital of Democracy is a non-profit organisation founded by the Innovation in Politics Institute, and we're based in Vienna with another office in Berlin. And we have a network of over 20 European countries in Europe. You can see here the European City Network has just expanded. We have 3 new member cities, Krakow and Sofia and Rotterdam. And the current European Capital of Democracy is Vienna, just taking over from Barcelona, who were the first ever European Capital of Democracy. This is a Network of Towns project. So we're working with the city of Antwerp, Barcelona, Bologna, Braga, Brussels, and Cascais to create this series of webinars. And this is all funded by the co-funded by the European Union. So today, the topic is disinformation in the city. And we have 2 experts here, Paul Costello and Ika Truesper. I'm going to go with that, so you can correct my pronunciation at will. So after this brief introduction, we'll go straight into the presentation, and then we'll have a round of Q&A before the summary and outlook. So I'll hand over to both Paul and Ika to begin the presentation.
It's lovely to see you all this evening. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here in Australia. And this morning for most of you. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and present about our Disinformation in the City Response Playbook. So my name's Ika Truesper, and I'm a research fellow in city diplomacy here at the University of Melbourne and a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague, Paul Costello, who is the Senior Manager for the Cities Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So the Disinformation in the City program is something that is a collaboration between the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a collaboration of researchers across 5 Australian universities. One of the key things that we've developed this year is the City Disinformation Response Playbook. And that's what we're going to talk about. We'll give you a really quick overview of the playbook, the process that we went through to develop it, why we developed it, what cities were telling us. This was very much something that was driven by industry need. And then just touch briefly on some of the sections. The playbook itself is available for download freely from the German Marshall Fund of the United States website and also from the website of the University of Melbourne, but it's actually now been republished by a number of other entities as well, which is fabulous. We want this to get out into the world and be as useful as possible. So the playbook itself was co-created with 40 disinformation experts, city representatives, media, tech representatives, academics, and others, and civil society and others from across North America, Europe, and Australasia. This is the playbook, you'll be able to see. We felt that it was really important to bring together these key different knowledge forms and to be able to apply them to the complex and collective challenge of disinformation as it impacts cities. And due to his expertise in cities and city networks, I'll hand over to Paul to give you an overview of the process that we underwent, and then also kind of the guiding principles around why we are working with cities, what the opportunities look like, and then I'll take you through some of the structure of the playbook.
Thanks so much, Ika. Can everyone hear me? Yes, I see some thumbs up. Thanks so much, and apologies for being 2 or 3 minutes late. And thanks also to the European Capital of Democracy for inviting us to present this. We've collaborated with the European Capital of Democracy on a number of occasions. Always a pleasure to be a part of their programming. As Ika mentioned, I'm Paul Costello, Senior Manager in the GMF Cities program in the Berlin office. And just as by way of very brief background, GMF is an organization that seeks to strengthen transatlantic cooperation in the spirit of the Marshall Plan and to further democracy. So this work is very much aligned with what the whole organization does, but in the cities program, working at the local level, this is especially important. So why are we talking about cities and disinformation? This, especially just a few years ago, this was really not an obvious thing in the disinformation space, nor in the foreign interference space, or in the democracy space, but really focusing on cities on this topic. From the cities team of GMF, it's always been quite obvious, and I won't go into too much detail here because I suspect that if you're joining this webinar, you're already somebody that understands the importance and the role of cities and democracy. But just very briefly, cities are not just where a majority of global population live. It's really where the daily experience of people is shaped through education, community, housing, economic opportunity, health, social cohesion. All these key aspects of people's daily lives are shaped by decisions and engagement at the local level. And cities obviously play a key role in that. And if we want to strengthen democracy, this is the first experience that people have of community and society in democracies. And so it is, in our opinion, critical. There's also been a neglect of cities in this space. City officials are not trained or really engaged on this topic. And so that's, as Ika was mentioning, there was an industry need. We were hearing from cities that they were really facing certain situations that they were not prepared or equipped to deal with. And in this aspect is where we saw also the big opportunity of this work and the gap to fill, in that cities are critical for democracy in many ways, but they're also the most trusted level of government. And if we're looking to either strengthen or repair people's relationship to democracy, it makes sense to start or to really engage with the most trusted level of government across most countries in Europe and in North America. And I expect the same in Australasia, but I haven't actually looked at the data, so Ika can correct me if I'm wrong. But we see that local government is the most trusted level of government. And cities really have the deep knowledge of their communities and societies and the real fault lines that are manipulated and that make communities vulnerable to disinformation of the dangerous and nefarious sort. And so it also is a bit, it's a huge problem that disinformation actors at the national level or at the regional level don't engage more with cities. And lastly, one of the important aspects is just cities' capacity to innovate and partner. So at the local level, it's easier for cities to try things, talk about it with other cities, see what their neighbors are doing, but also to partner with academic institutions, media personalities, community organizations, in ways that are very meaningful for this work. Could you move to the next slide, please? And as part of the process, which I'll talk about in a second, we surveyed the city representatives. So this was put together by a big cross-sector group, but particularly the cities we wanted to understand what they were seeing, dealing with, and worried about at the local level. And here you can see it's a bit small, but in the playbook you can zoom in better. But you can really see that there's certain things that trigger disinformation campaigns on a significant level. Certain media coverage, trigger them, but it's also how they manifest. So the triggering is on the right. So you see the policy debates, policy adoptions, events that are outside of cities' control, oftentimes at the national level or internationally, that lead to manifestations of disinformation. And the key topics, which are not going to be a surprise to any of you, but health and well-being, gender and sexual diversity, climate and sustainability, migrants and cultural diversity, and urban planning, with the ultra-low emission zone in London being one of the latest and key examples. And then, as I was saying on the left, kind of how we see this in cities. So the impacts that are visible and sometimes invisible, around city council meetings being closed off or not open to the public, as well as mass disruptions and protests that can have an impact on public safety and on individual safety, also as we saw in the UK riots recently. Just to say a few quick words about the process by which we put this together. And I don't know if you can hear me, sorry, there's a lot of background noise. We wanted a core of the participants that were co-creating this to be representative of cities, as I mentioned, and I think we had about 14 city representatives from across Australasia, Europe, and North America participating, but then also recruited some academics, some policy experts, some people who study disinformation, and very specifically, as well as representatives of the media and other relevant stakeholders for this work. Ika and her colleagues curated a series of fantastic workshops. So there were 3 workshops designed, but because of the very different time zones, they were all doubled. So it was 6 workshops where people could choose to engage in depending on their time zone. And in these workshops, we really were looking to, we prompted the workshops with some briefs and some key questions, but we were really looking to co-create this with participants and to really have this be something that emerged from the collective intelligence of the group, which was a hard exercise, especially when you have over 40 people of very different sectors and perspectives, but something that especially Ika did a wonderful job in weaving together in the end. And maybe the next slide, please, and then I'll hand back. And to start off with this group, we really set out a list of principles that we wanted to abide by in the process, but also that we wanted the outcome to be based on. And so here you see the key elements of trust, of non-partisanship, and other key pillars that we thought were important for this playbook to be used and relevant in the different areas that we were looking to fill this big gap in. With that, Ika, I'll hand over to you to delve into the content of the playbook.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think we'll stay with the principles just for a moment, because I think this is a really core aspect of the interdisciplinary, intersector process and outcomes that we were able to create, because there were a number of really key conversations that needed to happen throughout the process that demonstrated people's different perspectives, different levels of comfort or familiarity with different things. But it was really important that we clarified some of those core framings that we hope people will understand and abide by in using this playbook and further developing it and developing resources from it. As Paul said, one of the key aspects of that is non-partisanship, that the disinformation response cannot be partisan, because that is as corrosive as the disinformation itself in a political sense. But also, this playbook is not intended to change beliefs or diminish the rightful and essential democratic expression of dissent. So it's not about stopping people from protesting or stopping people from expressing differences of opinion. It's about restoring information integrity and addressing the harmful impacts of disinformation and the corrosive impact that has at an individual level, at an organizational level for those who are responsible for governance and other authorities, and at a community level. There's also a few key aspects in the principles around the fact that cities cannot deal with disinformation alone. This is a hugely pervasive, broad, complex issue that does not respect municipal boundaries, and that no one city is going to be able to address in isolation. It must be a multi-sector, multi-level, multi-city collaborative approach that is taken. Within that, cities need to be able to access information. And at the moment, there are a number of things that make it challenging for cities to do that, whether it's between themselves and other sectors, or with other parties within the cities, or other levels of government. So really articulating what those look like and enhancing those processes. And then there's also the need to innovate and to be courageous and to try new things in this context where we need to revitalize democracy, revitalise the way that we participate in our local democracies in a context of increased polarisation, hostility, and an information environment that is really contested. And that is a courageous thing that we're asking city leaders to do. And so putting in place the structures that can support that as well, and the processes so that that's something that's enabled, so it becomes organisationally and politically salient for that to happen. So we had a number of different core areas that emerged really prominently and quite quickly, even in the first group of the first round of discussions in these workshops that Paul mentioned. And the first core aspect of this was building trust and the need to establish a foundation of trust and trustworthiness across the city, across the different actors within cities, across the different actors that cities work with that might be beyond the municipal boundaries, but that's actually the foundations of disinformation response. And there's 4 key areas of this. There's trusted institutions, trusted information, trusted people, and trusted places. And it's recognizing that if we're trying to address disinformation, if we're trying to restore trust, if we're trying to build relationships, if we're trying to build community, we must have trusted institutions to be able to do that. There are no institutions that are trusted by everybody. But within a functional, vibrant, democratic city, everyone should trust a trustworthy institution that is connected into that web. A good example of this might be newly arrived communities might have more trust for a religious entity, for example, than they might for a local municipal authority. So how can that religious entity be brought into that trusted network so that when information needs to be disseminated, or when cities and others who are leading cities need to listen, that they're actually making sure that they're getting that information as well. But making sure that there's the institutional trust and that those institutions are connected to each other. Trusted information, recognizing that different groups also trust different types of information. There is no one kind of information that is trusted by everyone, and information is not accessible in the same ways to everyone. A good example of this is oral traditions. There are some communities who trust orally presented information more than they will trust, for example, a research report. Some people also highly trust academic research, for example, because of the rigor, because of the institutional processes. Others see that as representative of an elite that's increasingly hostile to their way of life. That is something that also decreases their trust in the informational outputs. So that needs to also be recognised across the city. Trusted people. So we trust information more depending on who is sharing that with us. So making sure that we understand who are the trusted people within communities. How can we make sure that A, they're acting in a trustworthy manner, and B, that they're part of a trusted network across the city that includes trusted institutions sharing trusted information. A really good example of this is that politicians, unfortunately, do not enjoy the highest level of trust as a profession within communities, within society. That's been demonstrated multiple times. Librarians actually enjoy a very high level of trust within communities. So how do we actually recognize that and tap into those trusted individuals? Likewise, with diverse communities, it's really important that people are hearing messages from people they trust, who they identify with. So that may be by gender, by life experience, by culture, all those sorts of things are really key. And trusted places. So these can be online places, they can be physical spaces. There are places within communities that are trusted to differing levels by differing groups. So if we want people to listen to information, to trust that information, we need to recognize that it needs to be shared by trusted institutions using trusted information, including trusted people in trusted places. So that's the foundation of disinformation response at the local level. Then there's the importance of building community. So actually restoring what it is that we're trying to focus on when we're responding to disinformation. It's not just responding to disinformation for its own sake. It's because we're trying to create the communities and the conditions for those communities and for that local democracy to be functional and to be able to deliver the aspirations of the people who live there and other stakeholders. So returning to that conversation includes creating a shared vision, making sure that people see themselves reflected in that mosaic that is the complexity of cities. Then being able to reinforce social expectations. So having that agreed social contract of how we want to be in community and as different actors, as different institutions, different organizations, we're serving and working within that. Bringing people together. We're increasingly alienated from each other. We are in an epidemic of loneliness. And in many ways, we've forgotten the ways that we can constructively disagree with each other. But we've also lost the opportunity to even connect with people with differing viewpoints. Sometimes that's spatially from an urban planning perspective, and sometimes that's more about the ways that we choose to engage with each other or don't. So finding those opportunities to really explicitly bring people together. And then understanding and addressing the fault lines within communities. So Paul touched on some of those key recurrent fault lines that we've seen in cities across the 3 geographies that we've worked with around climate and sustainability, urban planning, health and well-being, gender and sexuality, and migration, culture, and religion. But every community has their own fault lines. There are prejudices within every community. There is a history in every community. Understanding what those tensions are, because those are the tensions that a successful disinformation campaign is likely to tap into. We saw that in the recent UK riots, where a horrific event of the murder of several children very, very quickly tapped into anti-immigration rhetoric and specifically anti-Muslim rhetoric in some cases. And that was the fault line that was able to be very rapidly accessed, and one of the contributing factors to that being such an explosive campaign. Communicating and listening. So there is a whole big section. In fact, there's a section and a half on communicating and listening. We've got a policy section, and then we've got a general section on communicating and listening. And so I'm not going to go over all of that here, but just in terms of the key principles, it's really important for any organization, particularly local governments, but any organization in responding or engaging with communities and constituents and participants, that we need to be clear. We need to make sure that our communication is really conveying in a clear way what people need to know. We need to make sure it's accurate and have mechanisms in place and checks and balances to make sure that that accuracy is maintained. We need to be present. So people now access information very differently to each other and very differently to how we did even 10 years ago. So if people are accessing information in certain places, be present in those places. Be positive. So the emotional framing around disinformation response, narrative response, actually any communications, but in this case, around disinformation response is really important in terms of how people are then likely to respond to it and what their actions are likely to be afterwards. So positive framing helps people to be more empathetic, and there's very specific emotions within positive framing that have different outcomes as well. But they open us up to empathy. They can create a sense of connectedness, of hope, of wanting to invest in policy solutions, in wanting to find a better future, those sorts of things, as opposed to negative framings that can have some very polarizing and divisive impacts. And accessibility. So we have a variety of different ways that we are able to understand information and access it. So we need to make sure that all of those ways are being used so that everyone's able to participate. Collaboration, as Paul mentioned at the start, one of the superpowers of cities is collaborating, being able to work together. This has a whole variety of benefits. But the three key areas that were identified in the playbook that really need to be embedded within disinformation response at the city level are multi-city collaboration. So this is domestic city networks and also international city networks. This is important for sharing and for learning and for being able to increase the speed at which we can respond to disinformation, because we can learn and adopt from what other people have already trialed. We don't need to go through that whole process of reinventing the wheel ourselves. And it can also enhance the quality of the disinformation response, because there's the opportunity for people to reflect, give an external perspective on each other's initiatives, but also that opportunity, again, to build on the expertise and the experience of other cities. And then there's also the benefit of innovation. So the ways that that can actually help us to consider things from different lenses because of the contextual differences across different cities. In terms of multi-level governance, this is a really well-established space, for example, in the climate change field, where cities, national governments, state governments, in some cases, supranational entities as well, have really recognised and started to document the ways that they need to work together to have effective climate action. And that's entirely the case for disinformation response, where the majority of activity has been held at the national level and supranational level. And there are capabilities at those levels, particularly at the national government level, around specialised security apparatus, intelligence, all those sorts of things, and just the size of national government respective to a local government that really needs to be integrated with local response. Likewise, local and state or provincial response offers a huge amount of locally embedded knowledge, agility, and opportunity to actually enhance national level responses and to contribute to that broader overarching efforts across society. And then multi-sector. So we've identified a few of the key sectors. So tech, particularly as cities move more into a new phase of tech transitions, of energy transitions, making sure that tech companies are part of this journey. Businesses can be really effective. We saw that also, again, in the recent UK riots, where business leaders were actually able to come out and make a really strong stand in some of their communities in ways that they were legitimate to do so in the eyes of the particular groups that they were targeting, and other authorities did not have that same legitimacy. Media, academia, I feel like those are relatively self-explanatory. Communities, obviously, across the city are core to this. Education entities, civil society, and other impacted sectors. So health sector, for example, may be critical when we're looking at health-related disinformation, may not be as involved when we're looking at disinformation around urban planning, for example. The other really important aspect of the disinformation response playbook is the phased approach. So a lot of disinformation response has been really focused on the during and immediately after an event happens. So somewhat in the pre-bunking phase and spread prevention, and then largely in the debunking and fact-checking phase, which is quite a narrow space. And what we're actually proposing is that this needs to be on a much longer continuum and have 3 phases. So the first phase is actually it's the anticipatory phase. So the preemption of what might happen. And this is where we need to be building that foundation of trusted networks so that we're hearing what's happening in the community and that we're well placed to respond, but also making sure that we understand what the fault lines are in the community, where things are likely to be explosive if there is disinformation, and then also having early detection mechanisms so that if things do happen, because disinformation is part of our information landscape, this is something that is going to happen at the city level and at other levels, making sure that we're aware of that early. Then during, there's the spread prevention, which is about trying to take what could be a really explosive disinformation campaign and minimizing the harm that will have. And this is, again, relying on those trusted networks that have already been established, the collective narrative that we're returning to, all those sorts of things that have actually been done in that preventative and preemptive phase. And then there's pre-bunking as well. And so this is about recognizing that there's a likelihood that people may be exposed to a certain kind of disinformation. And so actually getting out there and giving people some information so that they're well prepared to be able to critically analyze that. And then after, there's the debunking and recovery phase, or I would say more kind of recovery and almost resilience phase. So looking at what's happened, helping people to make sense of that, whether it's through providing factual information, but also emotionally making sense of what's happened and recovering as a community. And we keep returning to the example of the UK riots, but this is something that has had a huge impact on many, many people within communities across England, and will continue to do so because those social fault lines have been driven further open, and that has caused all sorts of challenges for people in those communities. We see this also in other cities. A number of Swedish cities were targeted by a foreign interference campaign several years ago now, where the social services arm of the cities were accused of stealing Muslim children and taking them and rehoming them with Christian families and forcing them to undertake haram practices, or practices that were not acceptable for Muslim children. This has had a number of impacts, not least of which is the fact that those cities are still dealing with this. They're still dealing with the after effects of this campaign, which actually started several years ago. But also there are health impacts, because if people are less willing to bring their child to a health service or to engage with social services when they need it, that's actually going to have a very material impact on that child's life, on that family's life, on that community. These are the very, very tangible reasons why cities are so well placed, but also so uniquely impacted by disinformation. So that is, in a nutshell, an overview of the playbook. There's obviously a huge amount of nuance within those. Throughout the playbook, there are a number of different examples that are given of great things that cities are doing, or that civil society is doing, or different sectors are doing that could be adapted to the city context. And it's a vibrant space. I think as we go through this, it's very easy for discussions about disinformation to become very overwhelming, and to feel like it's impossible to know where to start. But the wonderful thing that I think we've been able to do with this process and with this playbook is to be able to, provide that starting point for cities, which hopefully will then be taken in any number of different directions by the cities and other organisations, but also to demonstrate just a fraction of the exceptional people and organisations that are out there that are actually already working to deliver really, really beneficial outcomes in this space. And so by lifting our gaze and recognising that this is a large collective effort, I think it can start to restore some of that hope and optimism as we do continue to embark on responding to this very complex challenge. So I'll finish there and hand back to you. But I hope that that's been helpful for some, hopefully all of you in the audience. And I'd love to hear if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Ika and Paul, for this presentation. And yes, we do already have questions. We're moving now into the Q&A section. So if you have a question, write it down in the chat. We're far too many to unmute microphones one at a time. But I will start with the first question from Sandra. So it's about the 10 principles that you showed at the beginning. And she's asking, how did you put them together? Were they part of the results of your research or served as a starting point?
Thank you. That's a fabulous question. So they were a result. So they came out of the workshops. Firstly, that there needed to be principles was one of the things that the 40 people in the room determined very, very quickly, but also deciding what that would look like was part of that workshop process. So in terms of the full process that we undertook for the playbook, we had an expression of interest process so people could put their hand up to be considered for selection to participate. From that, we selected 40 people. They were all then provided with pre-briefing materials so that they would have a baseline common understanding about disinformation, about cities, about some of the other key sectors that were involved. And then we had the surveying that Paul mentioned of the 14 participating cities and those results. We then had the workshops. After the workshops, all of those participants then contributed to reviewing the collective draft, which was an extraordinary process in terms of how many hands were on that document, but really engaged. After that, it actually went for peer review to other levels of government, to other cities, and to other entities, so media entities, for example, that hadn't been part of that as well, so they could also reflect on those things. And one of the things that they particularly reflected on were those principles, to make sure that that was something that was really reflective of where they all felt this needed to be placed. So that's actually the full process of how those were developed.
Thank you very much. We also have another participant here asking for more concrete examples. So you used the riots in the UK and the healthcare services in Sweden as examples. But do you have another example or two about how the response helped cities tackle disinformation or not?
Maybe I'll mention one or two, and then Ika, you can add to that. And thanks for the question, Antu. I think one of the examples that I've always found interesting and cited a few times is that of the city of Malmö, where they the city partnered with Nordic Safe Cities, which is a network of Nordic cities, and a think tank that works a lot on disinformation, and they were using the framework of hate speech and hate, but there's a lot of overlap with disinformation. But I found the framework to be very, very useful. And they started from the premise that the city has the responsibility to be safe in the digital space as well. So that just as the city has a responsibility in the physical space, they thought that that should be replicated digitally. And so they looked at where residents of Malmö were engaging online and accessing information online, and they mapped out the most frequented Facebook pages and another specifically Swedish or Nordic social media platform, and started to monitor hate and hate speech online. And they saw that there was clear correlations between certain events that would spark more expressions of hate, including what some far right activists do of going to a neighborhood with a high Muslim population and setting fire to a Quran, which is something that's obviously very provocative and protected by the Swedish constitution and freedom of expression. But so they started to understand a little bit the differences between what was happening in physical spaces and online. And that helped to inform a campaign that they did, which was Malmö Turns Its Back on Hate, where they gathered representatives of all the major faiths in the city to come together for this campaign. And they did many different things, but one of the things they did is organize themselves for the next time there was one of these Quran burnings, that everyone showed up and turned their back to the person doing this to kind of show that they were present, but refusing to engage in the provocation. But just this very premise of kind of cities having a responsibility. So the example that was given is that social workers who go out into neighborhoods where they would usually do their work should also be equipped and trained and able to engage online and identify issues that are driving communities apart and that are causing damage online. The other quick example I'll give, where a city didn't kind of have the tools or response ready, is that of Bodegraven in the Netherlands, which is a small town agricultural region, where the town became the center of a satanic conspiracy theory, similar to Pizzagate, but which eventually led to physical manifestations in the city. So people were coming from other parts of the Netherlands to leave flowers and notes in the graveyard, which was apparently the site of a horrific event. But this led to a lot of anxiety and fear among local residents who didn't understand even what was happening, because they weren't part of this online space where this was growing. And the mayor had no recourse, didn't know what was happening, had no one to talk to at the national ministry, didn't know, how to handle this, and luckily managed to kind of get a grip on things relatively fast, but has often expressed how kind of vulnerable the city was at that moment, and started a very small town started a big lawsuit against Twitter to remove what was happening online, and to kind of at least get rid of the information so that it didn't live there in perpetuity. And that lasted for a few years. But I don't know if you have additional examples you think should be added.
I think we can go to the next question, but there certainly are examples in the playbook, and so I encourage you to have a look at that.
Fantastic. So yes, I would encourage everyone to please write your questions in the chat, as we have a few more minutes here for the Q&A. And Graham is asking, what are your next steps after producing the playbook? Is your collaboration with the participants continuing?
That's a really exciting question. So at the moment, we're working on a number of different initiatives to help cities to implement this, and then to also track the efficacy, the whether it's effective, whether it's not, what parts of it are, and to understand the ways that we can continue to enhance this, I guess, with the experience of implementing it in different geographies. Some of the aspects of that are particularly around multi-level governance. So what are the capacities that need to be built in different levels of government, and what are the structures that need to be present to enable that in a meaningful way, given that it's also a securitized environment, that there are many complexities around working across different levels of government. Notwithstanding, those governments may be from different political perspectives and may not want to work together on this. So how do we actually frame that in a constructive way that we can make sure that cities have what they need to be able to respond to disinformation themselves, and to be able to contribute to the broader disinformation response? Also looking at the specifics of the intercity and the multi-city disinformation response, particularly finding ways of measuring and tracking the mobility of policies, of innovation, and of initiatives, and how they can be effectively grafted relatively swiftly to different locations, because of course everyone in the room, I imagine, would know you can't just pick up an initiative from city A and expect it to then be effective in city B. So really unpacking what's effective, why it's effective, what are the necessary core ingredients, and how can that be effectively and swiftly implemented? Because the next few years, this is still going to be a matter of building the plane while we're flying. We need to be very, very rapidly, but effectively responding to disinformation through perhaps the next 4 years. There's likely to be a heightened disinformation landscape, and heightened complexities in that space. So making sure that we really understand what are the structures that need to be in place and the relationships that need to be in place to enable that. And yeah, hopefully that will also be applicable to other complex problem solving. The other thing that we're doing is really working on tools with cities. We're going to be working on particularly those anticipatory mapping tools around understanding what your trust web, or I feel like we need a better word for that. So if anyone has a better word for that, please put that in the chat. But that trusted foundations of the 4 pillars that I went through at the start. How do you do that? How do you understand from that what your risk is as a community and as an organization about specific forms of disinformation? And how do you then apply that lens to policy making, to governance processes, to service planning, to spatial planning, all those sorts of things? So really understanding that and trying to put that into a very, very user-friendly tool or matrix that people can then use within their own environment. And also looking at things like organizational scans of what existing levers there are, given that cities are working in a very resource constrained environment with ever increasing pressures on time and on finances. And so really understanding what's already there within city functioning that can be used in disinformation response. So how can things be enhanced? Similarly to how Paul mentioned the social workers receiving training so that they were able to engage in the online environment that they hadn't previously been required to do, or perhaps didn't have the skills to do. How do we actually understand the existing assets and opportunities of cities, and how do we use those for disinformation response? And then there's all the thematic areas. Just this morning, I had an op-ed published on disaster disinformation and the way that disinformation related to disasters is increasingly impacting at the local level and needing to have really rapid responses, because if we do not trust our authorities and their information and the messaging that's coming from them in a disaster situation, that's deadly. And we're seeing that across different geographies. We've seen it in Spain, we saw it in the United States. So a whole variety of different things over the coming few years in this space. But certainly we would love to hear from cities and people from other sectors that are interested in contributing to this space, because it will continue to be very much a multidisciplinary, multi-sector collaboration that we need to progress with.
Thank you. Maybe we could just squeeze in one last question quite quickly. It's a follow-up for you, Ika. In your view, what do you think the most effective strategies for governments and social media platforms are when combating disinformation whilst safeguarding free speech?
So just like a small question to finish with. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think this comes back to one of those first principles, which is there is no one thing that is going to be effective. This is something that needs to be a long-term approach that includes education, that includes regulation. In the Australian environment, we're in a very different context to you in the EU. In terms of we don't have a lot of the regulation that you have. You have world's best regulation in this space, but making sure that that is robust and continues to be made more robust. And cities can have a voice in that. Cities absolutely have a strong advocacy voice. And again, that's a role for maybe cities' collective action to have that voice, both directly to tech companies, but also to regulators and other entities. But making sure that we're returning the conversation and the focus to how do we want vibrant local democracies to function, and what do we want them to do? Because we've had a really, really tough few years. We've had a global pandemic. we have rampant disinformation, we have increased polarization and populism in the political sphere, we have a cost of living crisis, we have massive housing insecurity, we have all sorts of things that are putting pressure on communities and that are detracting from our focus on what do we want this to look like? What is the future that we are focusing on, and how can we actually build all of our responses around returning to that? And I think that's where cities offer something really unique in this disinformation response landscape, because that's something that only happens at the level that people experience their lives, where they really feel that they can touch and feel the outcomes of that. And so I think that's a very important and exciting space for cities to be investing in.
Thank you very much for answering that one so succinctly, if I can get it out. Now, I know that one of my colleagues is rushing away and would also like to present something very quickly on the topic. So I will just share my screen and hand over to Mattis, please.
Hi, everyone. Nice talking to you. We all share that disinformation poses a major threat to the democracy and takes bold action to counteract this. And we at the ECUD NPO ask ourselves, what would be an efficient and creative way to do that? And I don't know if you know, but half of the population in Europe plays video games. And why not using video games as an educational program or entry point to empower people to combat disinformation? That's why we've created the Truth, Lies, and Democracy Game Jam. National and international teams come together to develop video games, which then would support people to become aware of disinformation, also support them to counteract disinformation. And this game jam will take place in Vienna, the title holding European Capital of Democracy, in autumn 2025. And if you are interested in collaborating, maybe sending a team to the game jam, or have a general interest in this format, please reach out to us. You're able to find all the information on the website. I'm sharing the link. And yeah, feel free to reach out. And we did the first pilot in Barcelona last year and it was very successful. They developed great video game ideas. And now in Vienna next year, we're gonna have the second edition. It will be a great format in the democracy year in Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you, Mattis, for presenting that very quickly. I know you need to shoot off to another call. So we will just take a look at what's happening in the rest of this series. So here we are in the last webinar of 2024, and you can see that we have a few more lined up for 2025. And that's on the next slide. We will hand over to the city of Cascais, who will have 2 webinars on the topic of inclusive social city development. So you'll be getting more information in the new year regarding these 2 webinars. And here are contact details, but I would also welcome you to please share your thoughts. We have one more open webinar at the towards summer 2025, and you can let us know which topics you would like to see at this webinar. I'm just posting the link in the chat here, and you can also scan that QR code and let us know which topics you would like to see in future webinars. So there's the link in the chat. Please write down which topics you'd like to see, and we'll take a look here at the results quickly before wrapping up. Peace and security, yeah, crisis management, housing crisis, immigration and mental health, civic education, all important topics. Do keep sharing them. And as I said, the recording of this webinar will be available on the website, as well as a summary of these results. So once again, thank you very much to Ika and Paul for presenting today. and all of you for taking the time to join us.